Hello everyone, and welcome to my December reading wrap-up. I read 13 books last month. 8 were by new-to-me authors, and 4 were new-to-me books by authors I'd read before. None of the books had been on my owned TBR shelves, and 1 was a reread. Regarding authors, 10 books were written by a woman, 3 by an author of color, 5 by a queer author, and 1 by a Jewish author. Regarding main characters, 12 books had at least 1 woman, 8 had at least 1 POC, 7 had at least 1 queer character, and 1 had a Jewish main character. The genre spread was 3 fantasy, 3 historical, 2 romance, 2 contemporary, 1 sci-fi, and 1 horror. 3 books were graphic novels, and 1 was a short story. I DNF'd 3 books. My ratings were 2 5 stars, 1 4.5 star, 3 4 stars, 3 3 stars, and 4 1 stars. 5 of the books I read were for the Queer Lit Readathon, which I did a separate wrap-up video for. I will link to that up in the cards and down in the description. I will finish wrapping up the other 8 books I read in December from lowest rating to highest. First is A Reliable Wife by Robert Goolrick. This was one of the books that I DNF'd. It is about a man who advertises for a wife, and when she comes, we learn basically that they're both planning to kill each other. I thought maybe this would be a book where I wouldn't like the characters, but they would still be compelling, the plot would be compelling, and that was not the case. The internal monologue for the main male character, Ralph, was constantly about sex. Detailed thoughts, his religious-induced guilt for wanting sex. It just went on and on for pages. The characters were so thin that you could just see through the author's self-indulgence in writing this book. It was awful. I gave it 1 star. Another DNF was Kulti by Mariana Zapata. This is a contemporary sports-themed romance. I had heard really good things about this book, so I was hopeful for a great slow burn romance. Unfortunately, that did not happen. The only reason this book is anything like slow is because the main character dwells on everything. Every time something new in the present happens, she has to go back 10 years, 20 years to her childhood to rehash the same things over and over again. It was an incredibly repetitive book. And for someone who has supposedly totally gotten over and moved on from her teenage crush from 10 years ago, she sure does mention him every other sentence. I couldn't handle it, and I DNF'd it. Next is Archenemies by Marissa Meyer. This is book 2 in the Renegade series that takes place in a post-apocalyptic world with superheroes. The only reason I forced myself to finish this book was because I was buddy reading it with someone. I was hoping from the first one that the second would redeem the series and get better, and it only got worse. It's even more annoying, more frustrating, and more slow, and more problematic than the first book. Like with Kulti, we get a lot of repetition that breaks away from the actual plot happening on the page, just to delve into the main characters' psyches over and over again with the same repeated points. I don't understand why all the adults are always missing from the important action parts where everyone's killing each other, even when that takes place in the one place in the city where the adults should be. The world building is just Swiss cheese. A lot of the character actions and interactions with each other are incredibly juvenile. The one character that I actually cared about from the first book was treated even worse in this one. And Meyer introduces something called Agent N, which is the supposed hero's solution to crime busting. Agent N is something that they freely give out to all of their heroes to use on people that they think are criminals to remove their superpowers. And the scenes that they describe this Agent N in and they use Agent N in is so gross. It's described very much as taking away something very important to the character, as it is, and it's not treated in the book with nearly as much nuance as it should be. I was really surprised that this book got through so many levels of review and proofreading and editing, and no one caught that this was an extremely problematic aspect. I will not be finishing this trilogy. Next is Otherbound by Corinne Duyvis. This is a fantasy young adult novel about two teenagers who are connected in their mind. Nolan lives on Earth, and every time he blinks, he can see into Amara's world, and for a long time she doesn't know this. Throughout the book, she does start to realize this, and the reasons for this connection start to unravel. I enjoyed reading this book, especially how diverse the characters are, not just in sexuality and race, but also disability. However, the ending didn't pay off for me. I didn't buy the supposed main romance. It seemed to exist solely to make the plot move forward rather than because it made sense for those two characters. And especially because those two characters have a power dynamic that's never really solved. I didn't quite understand how the magic worked by the end, and it ended abruptly without wrapping things up the way I would have liked. However, I really did enjoy the lack of romance between the main male and main female character, and I did like Nolan's relationship with his sister. I thought that was done very well. I gave this 3 stars. Next, I read The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, finally. I keep hearing everywhere that it's one of the greatest horror stories ever written, so I had to read it. I have seen the 1999 version of The Haunting movie, which I knew going in was very different from the original source. I did enjoy this story, but I need to read it again. Somehow I missed that there was an element of unreliable narrator going on, which would have helped me appreciate more the experience of reading the book. I thought that some of the dialogue was very strange and lacking continuity, especially between Theodora and Eleanor, but I thought that the horror elements were done really well. Jackson does a great job of having the horror or the scary bits happen off screen or out of sight, which makes the unknown element even scarier. That was done fantastically. Also, when I was going back and looking at some of the favorite quotes that I had marked, I could see the way Jackson had brilliantly crafted the writing of this story, and I think I will appreciate it even more upon a reread. So I gave this 3 stars. I was surprised to note right from the beginning just how much Stephen King ripped off to make Rose Red. I love Rose Red, but there are some extremely similar, if not exactly the same elements between the two. From the exact line, some houses are born bad, one of the main characters having a background of a childhood when stones fell on the house, the concept of a professor or scientist gathering a bunch of people who have psychic abilities to explore a haunted house, having a family descendant as part of the group. There were just way too many alignments, and I was disappointed in Stephen King to realize that even though he did diverge in Rose Red, that foundation for Rose Red didn't seem so much inspired by The Haunting of Hill House as stolen from it. Next, I read The Wicked and the Divine, Volume 2 by Kieron Gillen. I am enjoying the experience of reading these books, if only for the arts and colors, because they are utterly gorgeous. I love the Morrigan and to a lesser extent Baphomet, but there's really no lasting impact for me that makes me particularly want to return or care too deeply about the characters. I don't really understand how the magic works in this world, where the plot is going, what the character motivations are, so I'm not sure how much longer I will continue reading this series, but I am at least getting something out of the art itself. I gave it 3 stars. Next, I read Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. This book was actually mentioned in a video by the other Christine that reads as a book that she highly recommends, and I happened to find it that same day in a bookstore on sale, so I bought it and I read it. I really enjoyed this book. The writing was sensational, superbly crafted, often breathtaking, and the story itself had wonderful themes that were really well presented. It is a multi-generational story following the descendants of 2 sisters from Ghana, one of whom remains in Ghana and one who is taken as a slave to the United States. Each section of the book follows a different character in the same family over several generations, over 2 centuries. That structure was absolutely necessary to get the themes across that the author wanted. For me, on a personal level, I do prefer to delve deeper into particular characters. There were a lot of characters whose sections I felt like I was just getting invested in them, and then we would move on to a different character. However, those characters were written very well, and the wrap-up at the end of all these stories that we've touched on was crafted so perfectly that it all worked out in the end. It made sense, and it was worth not having those delves into only one or two characters like I usually want. I highly recommend this book. I gave it 4 stars. And last but not least, I finally finished my reread of Jane Eyre. I think it took me a good 3 months to do this. For the most part, I do think I like this book even more than I did upon my last reread, which was sometime in college, so many years ago. Jane Eyre as a character is one of the greatest characters I have ever read. She is so strong-willed. She's got great spirit. She knows what she wants, and she fights for it and refuses to back down on her standards. The dialogue and her thoughts throughout this book are spot on, often on fire. The writing is often just lush, something you can dive into, especially with the gothic atmosphere. Some of the descriptions that are used are darker and just solidly within that gothic genre. I saved so many quotes from this book on Goodreads, so you can check that out if you want to. I can't explain enough how much I love this book. However, I didn't give it 5 stars. I only gave it 4.5 stars only. It's still very high rating because there's still one part of this book that confuses me, that I struggle so much with, and that is Jane's romance with Mr. Rochester. I don't see how it's what she wants. I can see how it's what she wants in comparison to St. John, absolutely. But when Mr. Rochester first proposes to her and they go to the town and he insists on buying her all these things that she tells him she does not want, he completely ignores her. And she says in those scenes that she's annoyed, that she feels overwhelmed and like a totally different person than who she actually wants to be, that she's suffocated, and that doesn't change by the time she leaves. That part is never really resolved. The only reason it's resolved, and I'm getting into spoilers here, so if you haven't read this or heard about this, you might want to skip the next minute or so. But the only reason that she ends up with him at the end of the book is that he's blind. He needs someone to actually care for him. I just find that dynamic where she is only comfortable in the relationship because he is physically dependent on her strange, especially since she did not want to be dependent on him for him to be her protector, but she was completely willing to take on that role herself in their relationship. I feel like I've been missing something from that dynamic every time I've read this book, so if you have any thoughts on that, let me know down in the comments. Overall though, love this book. Love delving into it even though it took me so long. It really is one of those books that I could get buried into and just appreciate the heck out of it. Anyway, that's everything I read in December. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts on them are. Thanks for joining me.